Welcome to the Enigma of the Eclipsed Astronomer, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series The Feminine Mystique. Sherlock Holmes and the Women of Baker Street, playing in the year 1896. It was during renovations at our old Baker Street lodgings that a most singular trunk was unearthed from the attic. Within lay a collection of personal diaries and letters, penned by the very women whose lives intersected with our investigations. These accounts, which I have titled The Feminine Mystique, Sherlock Holmes and the Women of Baker Street, offer intimate perspectives from an era between 1888 and 1914, when society itself was in flux, and Holmes often found his methods tested by women who defied convention. From this remarkable collection, I shall now relate the circumstances surrounding a most perplexing affair. We begin with the case I have called the Enigma of the Eclipsed Astronomer. Chapter. The late autumn of that year had settled upon London with a determined chill. Fog, a familiar, ghostly visitor, swirled thick and yellow outside the windows of 221B Baker Street. Within, a cheerful fire crackled in the grate, casting dancing shadows upon the cluttered mantelpiece. The air carried the faint, lingering acrid scent of Holmes's morning chemical experiments. I had been engrossed in a rather stirring account of frontier adventure. Holmes, in contrast, now paced the room with restless energy, a caged tiger awaiting some fresh stimulus for his formidable intellect. The gentle rhythm of our quiet evening, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the turning of my pages, was broken by a rapping at the door, somewhat more insistent than the usual tradesman or casual caller. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson entered. Her customary cheerful demeanor was quite subdued, her brow furrowed with an anxiety unusual for our stoic landlady. The rustle of her skirts seemed to carry a weight of concern into the room, a subtle counterpoint to the otherwise peaceful atmosphere. Her voice was low, tinged with genuine distress as she spoke. "Mr. Holmes, forgive the intrusion at this hour, but a most dreadful piece of news has reached me. It concerns Miss Aurora Kingsley," said Mrs. Hudson. Holmes paused in his perambulations, his keen eyes fixing upon her. "Miss Kingsley, the astronomer, I presume. Pray be seated, Mrs. Hudson, and tell us what has occurred," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Mrs. Hudson settled into the edge of a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The firelight flickered across her troubled face. "She is dead, Mr. Holmes. Found this morning in her observatory. They are saying, they are saying it was her own hand. But the ladies from my little salon, you know, Mr. Holmes, the one I host in the downstairs parlor. It's become quite a hub, a lively little place where women of intellect and spirit gather. We discuss everything from social reform and the latest pamphlets on suffrage to art, literature, and even scientific advancements. It's a place of vigorous debate, but also great camaraderie. Miss Kingsley was a guest there often, you see, a brilliant, determined woman, much admired for her spirit as well as her intellect. She'd share her astronomical passions, and the ladies, they were so proud of her. They simply cannot believe she would take her own life, especially now. She was on the very verge of announcing some great discovery, something about a new star, or so I gathered," replied Mrs. Hudson. "I confess, the notion of a woman of science achieving such heights still struck me as somewhat novel, though I strove to maintain an open mind." Holmes, for his part, merely steepled his fingers, his expression inscrutable. The only sound was the soft sigh of the fire. Holmes's tone was initially dismissive, though not unkindly so. "A tragedy, no doubt, Mrs. Hudson, but such unfortunate events do occur. The pressures of intellectual pursuit can be immense," declared Sherlock Holmes. I ventured. "But Holmes, Mrs. Hudson seems to imply something more than misfortune. Her conviction is quite striking." Dr. John Watson inquired. Mrs. Hudson shook her head, her voice gaining a firmer note. "No, Mr. Holmes, it is more than that. Miss Kingsley, she spoke of fears, not in a flighty way, mind you. She was a most level-headed woman. She worried that her work, her calculations might be appropriated, stolen even. She felt the eyes of professional jealousy upon her, particularly from certain established gentlemen in her field who were dismissive of her theories, replied Mrs. Hudson. At the mention of stolen work and professional jealousy, I saw a flicker of interest in Holmes's eyes. He leaned forward slightly. Indeed. And this groundbreaking discovery you mentioned, was it widely known she was close to its revelation? Deduced Sherlock Holmes. She had intended to present her findings to the Royal Astronomical Society within the week, Mr. Holmes. It was to be her triumph. The ladies of the Salon feel most strongly that this supposed suicide is altogether too convenient for those who might have wished her silenced, or her discoveries claimed by another, said Mrs. Hudson. Holmes rose and resumed his pacing, though now his steps had a more purposeful air. His boots made a soft, rhythmic sound on the floorboards. The distant clatter of a hansom cab on the wet cobbles outside, a common London sound, seemed to punctuate the charged silence that had fallen in the room. His voice, when he spoke again, had lost its earlier detachment. It was replaced by a sharp, focused quality that brooked no argument. A woman of science, on the brink of a significant announcement, who fears intellectual theft and then is found dead under circumstances her closest associates find suspicious. You say she was a member of your salon, Mrs. Hudson. These are women of intellect and observation, are they not? Sherlock Holmes responded. Indeed they are, sir. Keen minds, all of them, and devoted to Miss Kingsley's cause and her memory, remarked Mrs. Hudson. Then their intuition warrants consideration. The official account may be simple, but simplicity can often be the most effective cloak for complexity, Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes turned to me, that familiar gleam in his eye heralding a new and intricate problem. Watson, it would appear our evening is to be more stimulating than your frontier tales. We must visit Miss Kingsley's observatory without delay. The stars, it seems, may hold more than just celestial secrets, stated Sherlock Holmes. I closed my book, the sound a soft thud in the expectant air. My own interest was now thoroughly kindled. The prospect of a new investigation, particularly one with such unusual facets, was always a welcome summons. The game, as Holmes would often remark, was afoot. The hansom cab's wheels clattered to a halt before a modest, yet well-kept house. Here, in this quieter district of London, the bustle of city life faded into a contemplative stillness. This wind, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant coal smoke, eddied around us as Holmes paid the cabman. Behind the main dwelling, a squat, domed structure, Miss Kingsley's observatory, rose against the grey sky, Holmes's keen eyes already fixed upon it. A constable, his breath pluming in the cool air, stood guard at the observatory door. He admitted us with a nod. The heavy door groaned on its hinges, the sound briefly disturbing the quiet as it opened into a surprisingly spacious chamber. The air within was cold, a profound silence pressing in, punctuated by the soft scuff of our boots on the polished wooden floor and the faint, rhythmic tick of a chronometer somewhere in the gloom. Dominating the room was a large brass telescope, its lens aimed towards the heavens in silent vigil. Charts and books lined the walls with severe neatness, their stillness undisturbed. Instruments gleamed softly in the dim light, filtering through a high, dust-moted window, casting long shadows across the floor. Meticulous, Watson, the domain of a precise and orderly mind. Yet even precision can be disturbed, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Indeed, Holmes, the order is remarkable. What sort of disturbance do you suspect in such a place? Dr. John Watson replied. Holmes moved with swift, silent grace, his gaze sweeping every corner. He paused by a tall bookshelf, his fingers lightly tracing the spines of several volumes. I heard the faint whisper of old paper. He then moved to a small writing desk. Here, papers were arranged with similar exactitude, though Holmes bent closer, his attention caught by a faint disarray. A sheaf of calculations lay slightly askew, a single, uncapped fountain pen beside it, its nib still bearing a trace of dark ink. My companion then directed his attention to a less conspicuous feature, a narrow side door, partially obscured by a heavy drape that shifted slightly, hinting at a draught from beyond. "And what have we here?" he murmured, drawing back the curtain. "A simple latch, Watson, scarcely adequate to secure a garden shed, let alone a repository of valuable research. One might almost say an invitation," observed Sherlock Holmes. "Extraordinary, Holmes, for a woman of such evident intellect and precision to overlook such a basic security measure. It seems a glaring oversight," asked Dr. John Watson. As Holmes examined the lock, the main door creaked open again, and a portly gentleman with a self-important air entered. He introduced himself, his voice a somewhat pompous baritone, as Dr. Alastair Finch, the physician who had first examined Miss Kingsley. "Mr. Holmes, I presume," the doctor's voice oozed condescension. "Scotland Yard informed me you might be, taking an interest. A clear case of melancholia, I assure you. Tragic, of course. These intellectual women," he sniffed, "often overtax their delicate constitutions," responded Dr. Alastair Finch. Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. I noted a subtle tightening around his lips as Dr. Finch spoke. "Indeed, Doctor, and the means by which Miss Kingsley met her end," Sherlock Holmes noted. He gestured vaguely towards the desk. A phial of laudanum, empty, found beside her. The note was quite clear. A mind overwrought, no doubt by her celestial preoccupations. Dr. Alastair Finch replied. "A tragic conclusion, if true, Doctor. Yet this meticulousness we see everywhere. It sits uneasily with the idea of a mind so completely undone," asked Dr. John Watson. Holmes's eyes, however, were not on the desk. He indicated a faint scuff mark near the base of the telescope's heavy pedestal, a fresh blemish on the otherwise pristine floor. He then pointed to a celestial chart on a nearby table. It was creased irregularly, the paper itself seeming to rustle with the memory of being grasped and smoothed in haste. "Tell me, Dr. Finch," his tone was deceptively mild, "did Miss Kingsley typically work with such agitation? This chart, for instance, appears to have been handled with rather less care than her other effects, and this mark upon the floor, a stumble, perhaps, in her final moments," explained Sherlock Holmes. The doctor puffed out his chest slightly. "My dear sir, in such distress, one cannot expect perfect composure. These are trifles. The note, the file, the evidence is conclusive," responded Dr. Alastair Finch. "Perhaps," Holmes replied, his voice carrying a sharper edge now. "Or perhaps they are the very details that whisper a different story. An intruder gaining access via that woefully inadequate side door, a confrontation. It is a narrative that also begins to form." He turned to me. "Our work here is done for the moment, Watson. The stars in this observatory may be silent, but the human constellations surrounding Miss Kingsley may yet speak volumes," explained Sherlock Holmes. "And those constellations, I suspect, are where the truth lies, Holmes, not in the convenient narrative Dr. Finch presents. I am ready when you are," Dr. John Watson inquired. With a curt nod to the baffled Dr. Finch, Holmes swept out, leaving me to follow. As the observatory door closed behind us with a decisive thud, I knew our investigation had truly begun. His words clearly indicated our next destination would involve delving into the late astronomer's personal and professional circles, a task for which Mrs. Hudson's Salon seemed the ideal starting point. The chill of Miss Kingsley's observatory lingered as we departed. Holmes, ever restless, swiftly declared our next destination. "The physical evidence is a puzzle, Watson," he'd remarked, his breath misting. "But to grasp motive, we must explore Miss Kingsley's life. Mrs. Hudson's Salon, I fancy, will provide soundings." Soon, We were in our landlady's familiar parlor, today somber, a hub of earnest discussion. The comforting aroma of tea and scones mingled with the sharp scent of ink from pamphlets. A low murmur and the clink of china filled the room. Her voice, though laced with sorrow, held its customary firmness as she greeted us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am relieved you are taking an interest. Aurora, Miss Kingsley, her loss is keenly felt here." "These ladies knew her well," replied Mrs. Hudson. She gestured towards a group of perhaps half a dozen women, their expressions a mixture of grief and a certain simmering indignation. The rustle of their skirts seemed to whisper of shared confidences. Mrs. Hudson made the introductions. Miss Albright, Mrs. Davies, they were both close to Aurora. Miss Albright, a woman with keen, intelligent eyes, spoke first. "It is an outrage, Mr. Holmes," Miss Albright said. Her voice rose with indignation. "To suggest Aurora would take her own life on the very cusp of greatness. She faced obstacles, yes, the sort any woman of intellect encounters in this man's world, but she was a fighter." A murmur of agreement went around the small assembly. The air crackled with a shared sense of injustice. Mrs. Davies, older and her voice softer, almost tremulous, then added, "She was troubled these past few months. Not by her work, that was her passion, but she spoke of shadows, Mr. Holmes, of feeling her research was being watched. She feared her discoveries might be snatched away before she could claim them," Mrs. Davies replied. Holmes, who had been listening with his characteristic intensity, leaned forward slightly, his eyes glinting. His voice cut through the quiet room, sharp and incisive. "Did she mention any specific individual, Mrs. Davies, or any particular institution from which she felt this threat emanated?" Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. She shook her head slowly, her gaze distant. "Not by name, no. It was more a general sense of professional encroachment. She felt some of the established figures in astronomy were too quick to dismiss her, yet too eager to learn what she was uncovering. She once said, with a rather mirthless laugh, that they would patronize her in public and scrutinize her notes in private," answered Mrs. Davies. Miss Albright interjected, her tone sharp with conviction. "It was the jealousy, pure and simple. Aurora was on the verge of something that would have made many a celebrated career look rather dated. They couldn't bear the thought of a woman eclipsing them," replied Miss Albright. I watched Holmes absorb these testimonies, his long fingers steepled. For a moment, the only sounds were the gaslight's gentle hiss and the distant, rhythmic clatter of a dray horse on the cobbled street outside. He spoke then, his voice measured and thoughtful. "It becomes clearer. Miss Kingsley's fear was not primarily of physical harm, but of intellectual theft. The anxiety you describe aligns with a desire to protect her life's work, a life's work perhaps coveted by a rival who understood its profound significance. Consider the simple lark we observed at the observatory, Watson. It becomes less a sign of carelessness and more, perhaps, an indication of a known, or at least unsuspicious, visitor, or indeed one who could make their entry appear so," Sherlock Holmes said. A collective sigh, almost of understanding, passed through the Salon members. They had voiced their fears, and Holmes had given them a framework. "The shadows Miss Kingsley perceived," he continued, his gaze sweeping the room, "were likely cast by those who coveted her brilliance. To pursue this further, we must speak with someone who was intimately acquainted with her daily research and her interactions within the scientific community. Mrs. Hudson, Miss Kingsley employed a young assistant, I believe," explained Sherlock Holmes. Her expression brightened with a new resolve. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes. Young Lily Morstan, a very bright girl and devoted to Aurora. She works at the Royal Astronomical Society Library. I can furnish you with her direction," replied Mrs. Hudson. He rose, a decisive air about him. "Excellent. Watson, our path leads us next to Miss Morstan. She may hold the key to identifying who amongst the stargazers wished not only to see Miss Kingsley fall, but to pluck her discoveries from the heavens as their own." replied Sherlock Holmes. The whispers in the salon had given way to a more tangible line of inquiry. As we took our leave, the scent of tea seemed less heavy, replaced by the invigorating prospect of the hunt. The Royal Astronomical Society's halls loomed around us, their somber grandeur almost palpable. Old paper and floor polish scented the air, while a great regulator clock ticked rhythmically in the distance, punctuated by the hushed rustles of activity behind mahogany doors. Holmes paced, his gaze sweeping the portraits of astronomers lining the corridor, their painted eyes seemingly following him. Soon, light, hesitant footsteps echoed on the marble floor as a young woman approached. Miss Lily Morstan, assistant to the late Miss Kingsley and a valued member of the Baker Street Irregulars Sisterhood. Her expression was earnest, her sadness clearly showing genuine affection for her employer. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming. I want to help if I can," Lily Morstan said. Her voice, though clear, was subdued. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Your willingness does you credit, Miss Morstan. Pray, tell us of Miss Kingsley in these past few weeks. We understand she was under some considerable strain." Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. We entered a small, sparsely furnished anteroom. Weak afternoon light filtered through a tall, grimy window, illuminating dancing dust motes. Lily perched on the edge of a stiff chair, hands clasped tightly. She was, sir, more agitated than I had ever seen her. She spoke often of her work, of course, the great announcement she was preparing. But there was a fear in her, a new fear. She would start at sudden noises, and I often found her staring out of the observatory window, not at the stars, but at the gardens below, as if expecting someone, replied Lily Morstan. Her voice trembled slightly. Holmes leaned forward, his tone gentle yet probing. Did Miss Kingsley name anyone specific, or give any particular reason for her fear? Stated Sherlock Holmes. Not by name, sir, but she spoke of vultures, of those who might wish to pluck the fruits of her labor before they were ripe. It was her phrase, sir. She felt her theories were vulnerable, especially to those who had previously dismissed her, Lily Morstan said. And Professor Julian Thorne, how did he figure in Miss Kingsley's recent life? Asked Dr. John Watson. I interjected, recalling the name from Mrs. Hudson's Salon. At Thorne's name, Lily's brow furrowed. She chose her words carefully. Professor Thorne. He visited Miss Kingsley's private observatory on several occasions. Uninvited, I believe, on at least two of them. Miss Kingsley always seemed disquieted after his visits. He was publicly quite disparaging of her work, yet he seemed intensely interested in her methods, remarked Lily Morstan. Holmes leaned closer, his eyes glinting. Indeed, can you recall any particulars of his visits, or any habits of the professor that struck you as noteworthy? Observed Sherlock Holmes. Lily paused, her brow knit in thought. He was a man of very precise habits, Mr. Holmes, excessively neat, and most particular about his tools. I recall one occasion he was demonstrating on Miss Kingsley's older slates. She preferred them for rough work. He produced his own chalk, not our common sort, but a special French chalk. He stressed its suitability for detailed astronomical sketches, its fineness, its rare source. Imported specially, he said. He would use no other, replied Lily Morstan. Her gaze met Holmes's. A faint smile touched his lips. A man of specific tastes, it would appear. This French chalk, Miss Morstan, was it a common brand, easily procured? Replied Sherlock Holmes. Oh, no, sir. He mentioned it was from a small supplier in Amiens, and he ordered it directly. He even complained once when a shipment was delayed. Miss Kingsley found his fastidiousness rather irritating, I think, Lily Morstan answered. The great clock in the hall chimed the quarter hour, its resonant tones underscoring the moment. Holmes rose, his expression thoughtful, his voice, when he spoke, returning to its usual briskness. Your testimony has been invaluable, Miss Morstan. You have provided a most significant thread, observed Sherlock Holmes. Descending the wide stone staircase, The echo of our footsteps seemed louder in the fading light. The scent of damp wool from my coat mingled with the aroma of old books as we departed. That particularity about the chalk, Holmes. You believe it's significant, commented Dr. John Watson. I ventured as we emerged into the grey London afternoon. The rumble of drays and cries of street vendors contrasted sharply with the society's quiet. Holmes hailed a hansom, his eyes distant, focused. His reply was sharp, with renewed purpose. Everything is significant, Watson, especially the seemingly trivial affectations of a man who professes disdain, yet displays an undue interest. The stage is gradually being set, my dear fellow, and the properties are falling into place. Sherlock Holmes responded. He gave the cabman an address I recognized with a jolt. Miss Kingsley's observatory. The game, as Holmes often said, was once more afoot. As Holmes and I re-entered Miss Aurora Kingsley's private observatory, the chill of late afternoon settled around us. The silence inside was deep. It was broken only by the faint, rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock in the house nearby. This sound seemed to measure the stillness of a life cut short. Dust motes danced in pale shafts of light from the high windows. They illuminated the great brass telescope, a silent monument to its owner's passion. Holmes, without a word, went straight to the large slate blackboard near the observation platform. It was the same slate where the police had found the brief farewell note. Their efficient, if uninspired, hands had wiped it clean. Holmes, however, was not interested in the last message. He focused on what might have been there before. He took out his powerful lens and began a close examination, his brow furrowed. For a long while, the only sounds were the soft scrape of his lens on the slate. I also heard the distant rumble of a dray cart on the cobbled street outside. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. It was charged with an almost electric intensity. Observe, Watson, the police, in their haste, recorded only the obvious. They have overlooked the history etched beneath, Sherlock Holmes said. I stepped closer, peering at the dark surface. At first I saw nothing but the faint sheen from the cleaning cloth, but Holmes angled the slate to catch the light. Then I began to see them, faint, ghostly outlines of figures and symbols. They were not completely erased. They had been rubbed out with such force that the pressure had left subtle marks on the slate itself, almost microscopic scratches. My word, Holmes, I exclaimed. It appears calculations were here and rubbed out with considerable force. Dr. John Watson inquired. Precisely, Watson. These marks weren't merely wiped away. They were scoured, as if to erase their very existence. This was concealment, not tidiness. And observe this. He pointed with his penknife. There was a faint, powdery residue on the very edge of the slate's wooden frame. It was almost invisible to the naked eye, stated Sherlock Holmes. He carefully scraped a tiny sample onto a slip of paper. This, I fancy, is no common chalk. It has a particular fineness, a certain luminous quality, French, if I am not mistaken. Indeed, it's an expensive variety. It's not usually found in a lady's private observatory unless she specifically sought it out, remarked Sherlock Holmes. Holmes straightened. His eyes gleamed with that familiar light of dawning certainty. His next words came with a quiet emphasis that made them more impactful. Miss Morstan's testimony from yesterday returns to me quite clearly, Watson. She spoke of Professor Thorne. He had an almost fanatical insistence on a specific brand of imported French chalk for his work. She described it as being of a singular whiteness, did she not? And she mentioned he guarded his supply with peculiar jealousy. The very same chalk, I'll wager, has left its spectral signature here, observed Sherlock Holmes. The implication was startling. If Thorne used such chalk and traces of it were found here, amidst erased calculations vital to Miss Kingsley's discovery. Good heavens, Holmes, you believe Thorne was here, that he erased her work, Dr. John Watson commented. He nodded, his gaze sweeping the observatory. The chalk is a significant link, Watson. It is hardly circumstantial, particularly when combined with Miss Morstan's precise memory of his habits. As for his entry, consider the side door to the garden. On our first visit, we noted its latch was insecure. It could be easily opened from outside. The police overlooked this. They were content with the idea of a room locked from within. Thorne would have known Miss Kingsley's routines, her solitary nights here. A quiet approach, a silent entry, observed Sherlock Holmes. He paused, letting the grim picture form in my mind. The wind moaned softly past the eaves of the observatory. It sounded like a sigh for the secrets the building held. When Holmes broke the silence again, it was with purpose. The shadows on this slate speak volumes, Watson. They tell of a desperate attempt to steal or suppress a discovery. It is high time we paid a visit to Professor Julian Thorne at the Royal Astronomical Society. I fancy he will have much to explain. With those words, he turned and strode to the door. He left me to ponder the darkening web of jealousy and ambition. This web was now closing around Aurora Kingsley's memory. The November morning air remained chill as Holmes, and I journeyed towards the Royal Astronomical Society. Our hansom clattered over cobblestones, a familiar sound, yet today underscoring a grim purpose. Holmes was mostly silent since our visit to Miss Kingsley's observatory, his mind intently sifting the implications of the erased slate and the specific French chalk. Inside the Society's grand hall, our footsteps echoed on polished marble. The cool, still air carried the faint scent of old paper and leather. A hushed reverence filled the space, broken only by a distant clock's tick-tock. A liveried attendant, speaking in a low murmur, directed us to Professor Julian Thorne's study. Professor Thorne was a man of perhaps 50 years, with a high forehead, sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and a mouth that was set in a perpetually critical line. He rose from a large desk, cluttered with star charts and open volumes as we were announced, his greeting civil but noticeably lacking in warmth. His voice was precise, almost clipped. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, to what do I owe this unexpected visit? I trust it pertains to the unfortunate matter of Miss Kingsley," answered Professor Julian Thorne. Holmes inclined his head, his own tone deceptively mild. "Indeed, Professor, a most tragic affair. We are endeavoring to understand the circumstances leading to her demise. You were aware of her work, I presume," deduced Sherlock Holmes. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Thorne's eyes before he replied, his voice taking on a dismissive edge. "Miss Kingsley," Thorne's tone dripped with condescension. "Oh, her theories were ambitious, certainly enthusiastic, though perhaps lacking the rigorous foundation one expects in serious astronomical discourse. A great pity she allowed her passions to overcome her reason," Professor Julian Thorne said. He gestured vaguely towards a bookshelf laden with astronomical journals, the rustle of his sleeve a small, dry sound in the quiet room. "Her passion for discovery, you mean?" Holmes pressed, his gaze unwavering. "She was on the verge of announcing something quite significant, was she not? Something concerning previously unobserved celestial phenomena," Sherlock Holmes responded. Thorne shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming a light tattoo upon his desk. The sound, though faint, seemed unnaturally loud in the charged silence. He gave a short, dry laugh. "Speculation, Mr. Holmes. She often spoke of grand revelations. One learns to filter such pronouncements. Her methods, I fear, were somewhat unorthodox, not always adhering to established protocols. For instance, her insistence on certain foreign materials for her work, quite unnecessary affectations," responded Professor Julian Thorne. I saw Holmes's eyes sharpen almost imperceptibly at the mention of foreign materials, a clear reference to the French chalk. Thorne, however, seemed oblivious, warming to his theme of dismissal. "And yet," Holmes countered, his voice now carrying a sharper edge, "her notes Even those she attempted to erase indicated a meticulous mind. Did she ever discuss with you the security of her observatory? Perhaps concerns about unauthorized access, say, through an unsecured side entrance, Sherlock Holmes said. Professor Thorne's composure visibly fractured. His face paled slightly, and he drew a quick breath. His voice was suddenly strained, losing its earlier assurance. I. I know nothing of her security arrangements. Why would I? Our discussions were purely theoretical and infrequent at that. What exactly are you implying, Mr. Holmes? Answered Professor Julian Thorne. Despite his denial of frequent contact, the professor's composure cracked. He leaned forward, eyes gleaming, and launched into a series of highly specific questions about Miss Kingsley's impending announcement. Each query revealed a startlingly intimate knowledge of her research's potential trajectory. Holmes listened patiently, then rose. Merely exploring all avenues, Professor, you have been most informative. His emphasis on the final word was subtle, yet carried a distinct weight, declared Sherlock Holmes. As we walked back out into the echoing hall, the heavy oak door of Thorne's study closing behind us with a soft thud. Holmes turned to me, a grim satisfaction on his face. Observe, Watson. A man who professes disdain for Miss Kingsley's work, yet displays an almost feverish curiosity about its precise details. He dismisses her methods, yet inadvertently alludes to specific materials she used. He denies close association, yet probes for information as if her findings were his own lost property. A paradox indeed, Sherlock Holmes noted. The distant clang of a gate being shut somewhere outside punctuated his words. I felt a familiar thrill, the certainty that Holmes was tightening the net. So you believe he is more deeply involved than he admits? I asked, my voice lowered. Dr. John Watson added. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. His anxiety, Watson, is palpable. He knows more, far more. But to prove it, we shall need to understand the landscape of professional jealousies and whispered confidences within this rarefied world. It is time, I think, to see what intelligence our young friends in the sisterhood have managed to glean, replied Sherlock Holmes. The day following our somewhat unsettling interview with Professor Thorne found Holmes in a state of restless anticipation. He paced the familiar confines of our Baker Street rooms, the rhythmic creak of the floorboards beneath his feet, a steady counterpoint to the distant, muffled roar of London. The fog, a persistent autumn visitor, pressed greyly against the window panes. The occasional clatter of a passing hansom cab punctuated Holmes's thoughts, each sound a muffled exclamation in the damp air. This web of professional jealousy, Watson, is more tangled than a fisherman's nightmare. Thorn is but one strand, I fancy. We require a wider cast of the net, deduced Sherlock Holmes. A light tap at the door preceded Mrs. Hudson, who announced, her voice slightly muffled, "A Miss Morstan to see you, Mr. Holmes." Presently, young Lily Morstan entered, her usual bright demeanor tempered with a quiet seriousness. She carried a slim portfolio, and the faint scent of ink and damp paper clung to her. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I have collated the initial reports from the sisterhood," replied Lily Morstan. Holmes gestured towards a chair, his eyes keen. "Proceed, Miss Morstan. Every detail, however insignificant it may seem," observed Sherlock Holmes. Lily opened her portfolio. The rustle of foolscap was distinct in the quiet room as she selected a page. "The astronomical community, as you suspected, Mr. Holmes, is indeed a hothouse of suppressed rivalries. Miss Kingsley's imminent announcement had caused considerable stir," Lily Morstan answered. "Many felt her theories, particularly concerning stellar parallax and nebular composition, were unorthodox. Some were openly dismissive, others, we've learned, privately intrigued but publicly cautious," answered Lily Morstan. "So, a general atmosphere of resentment, then," I ventured, my medical instincts sensing the undercurrents of professional jealousy. For Miss Kingsley, Holmes, navigating such animosity, particularly as a woman striving in that male-dominated field, must have been a terrible strain, an immense burden, surely. Dr. John Watson added. Lily nodded, her expression acknowledging the truth of my words. Precisely, Doctor. But we have also pursued more specific avenues. One of our informants, posing as a charwoman at the offices of the Astronomical Chronicle, overheard several heated discussions. There is one name that surfaced with some regularity, a Dr. Alastair Finch, responded Lily Morstan. Finch, Holmes repeated, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. The name is not unfamiliar, known for his somewhat derivative papers on celestial mechanics, if memory serves, observed Sherlock Holmes. The very same, sir. It appears Dr. Finch has a reputation, whispered rather than spoken aloud, for appropriating the research of others. Lily Morstan answered. Holmes raised an eyebrow almost imperceptibly, a silent invitation for her to continue. The only sound was the soft ticking of the mantel clock. One of our sisters, who has a cousin employed as a printer's apprentice, discovered that Finch had made unusually frequent visits to the print shop that handled some of Miss Kingsley's preliminary monographs. He seemed overly interested in her proofs, Lily Morstan said. Holmes leaned forward slightly, a flicker of genuine interest in his normally impassive eyes. And this Finch, what is his current standing? His reaction to Miss Kingsley's demise, Sherlock Holmes said. He expressed conventional shock, sir. Publicly, at least. But our sources indicate he was deeply agitated in the days leading up to Miss Kingsley's planned announcement and noticeably relieved afterwards, said Lily Morstan. He has since announced his intention to publish a paper on a topic remarkably similar to one Miss Kingsley was known to be exploring, remarked Lily Morstan. I saw Holmes file this information away, his expression unreadable. The thoroughness of the sisterhood was indeed impressive, their tendrils reaching into the most unexpected corners of the city. He then mused, almost to himself, yet loud enough for us to hear. A plagiarist is a thief of the mind, certainly, and a desperate thief may resort to desperate measures to protect his ill-gotten gains or to secure future ones. It is a plausible motive, Miss Morstan, a very plausible one, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Lily then laid out further findings from the sisterhood, her voice calm as she recounted them from her notes, the papers whispering softly with each turned page. It was a tapestry of lesser anxieties and petty squabbles they had unearthed. A protégé whose theories Miss Kingsley had gently critiqued, now nursing a bruised ego. A contemporary who felt overshadowed by Kingsley's rising star. Each thread she presented painted a clearer picture of a fiercely competitive world, where recognition was a hard-won prize, particularly for a woman like Aurora Kingsley. The air in our rooms seemed to grow heavier with the weight of these unspoken resentments, the crackle of the fire in the hearth the only sharp sound. Lily then added, her tone neutral. We also confirmed that Professor Thorne, despite his public skepticism, had made several attempts to engage Miss Kingsley in private correspondence regarding her research, all of which she politely rebuffed. Lily Morstan replied. Holmes rose and began to pace once more, the floorboards groaning their familiar protest beneath his measured tread. The sounds from the street seemed to recede as he considered the new data. Excellent work, Miss Morstan. You and your associates have provided a most valuable overview. This Finch bears watching, and Thorne's duplicity is further confirmed. Yet, stated Sherlock Holmes. He paused, and the light tap of his long fingers on the mahogany table was the only sound for a moment. While these jealousies and potential plagiarisms provide motive for silencing a rival, I am not yet convinced they encompass the entirety of this tragedy. Sherlock Holmes responded. His voice grew more decisive, cutting through the somber atmosphere Lily's report had created. The true worth of Miss Kingsley's discovery, the very nature of the intellectual property at stake, that, I believe, holds the ultimate key. It is time, Watson, that I immersed myself in the stars as Miss Kingsley saw them. He turned towards the mantelpiece, where the fire cast a flickering glow upon a small, unassuming notebook, Miss Kingsley's, recovered from the scene that lay waiting. The promise of unraveling her astronomical theories seemed to energize him, and I knew from the sudden brightness in his eyes our investigation was about to take a very different and doubtless more complex trajectory. The days following the Sisterhood's report found Holmes in a state of profound immersion. Our rooms at 221B Baker Street were transformed into a veritable shrine to the late Miss Aurora Kingsley. Charts of celestial bodies, dense with calculations, were strewn across the settee, the floor, and even encroached upon my own armchair. The air, thick with the scent of shag tobacco, was frequently punctuated by the dry rustle of papers as Holmes paced, a restless tiger in his den. The only other sounds were the crackle of the fire in the grate and the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn from the Thames, a fitting dirge for the eclipsed astronomer. "Watson," he cried, his voice cutting through the quiet with a keen edge of discovery. "Attend to this. Do you see the progression here, the sheer audacity of this theoretical leap?" Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. I rose and peered over his shoulder at a series of intricate formulae. The scratching of his pen had been a near-constant companion for hours, only now breaking for this exclamation. "It is, I confess, largely incomprehensible to me, Holmes," I admitted, shaking my head. "These formulae might as well be hieroglyphics," Dr. John Watson said. "Precisely," he rejoined, his eyes gleaming. "And therein lies its brilliance, and tragically its danger. Miss Kingsley was not merely refining existing models, Watson. She was proposing a fundamental shift, a new way of seeing the universe itself. These calculations suggest," remarked Sherlock Holmes. He paused, tapping a particular equation with a long, nicotine-stained finger. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial hush as he continued, "that the universe was far older and behaved in ways far more energetic than anyone currently believed. She was on the verge of revealing celestial truths that would overturn decades of accepted astronomical principles." Sherlock Holmes responded. He resumed his pacing, but now with a triumphant energy. The papers in his hand seemed to vibrate with the force of his enthusiasm. I watched him, fascinated by the intellectual fire that burned so brightly within him. It was in these moments, when he unraveled the tangled skeins of human thought or action, that Holmes was truly in his element. "Think, Watson," he continued, his voice now resonant with conviction, "of the implications. Entire careers, reputations built upon the very theories she sought to overturn," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He gestured emphatically with the papers, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase, now turned towards human motive. "Consider a man like Professor Thorne, whose pronouncements are taken as gospel. Her work did not merely challenge him, it threatened to obliterate the foundations of his life's work," observed Sherlock Holmes. "So you believe this is the motive, then?" I asked, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "Not jealousy of a woman's success per se, but the terror of intellectual annihilation," commented Dr. John Watson. "It is the most potent motive imaginable for a certain type of academic mind," Holmes stated, his voice firm. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. I considered his words, the image of a scholar's world collapsing under the weight of new truth taking shape in my mind. To be proven fundamentally wrong, to see one's legacy crumble to dust before a younger, more brilliant intellect, particularly one from a quarter so often dismissed, would be an unbearable blow, observed Sherlock Holmes. I confess, a shiver ran down my spine at the cold logic of his assessment. The world of academia, which I had always considered rather benign, suddenly seemed capable of harboring the darkest passions. "They would not merely wish to discredit her, Watson," he continued, his tone hardening. They would need to silence her permanently before such revolutionary ideas could gain traction, before she could present her proof, replied Sherlock Holmes. Holmes stood motionless before the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Outside, gas lamps flickered, casting restless shadows across the room. The clatter of a passing hansom cab broke the silence, its wheels beating a steady rhythm on Baker Street's cobblestones. Yes, he mused, his voice quieter now, yet filled with a grim certainty. Her theories were the key. Someone understood their earth-shattering potential and acted to ensure they remained eclipsed, remarked Sherlock Holmes. He turned from the fire then, his gaze sweeping across the scattered papers that bore testament to Miss Kingsley's brilliant, tragically curtailed, mind. The question now becomes, how does one extinguish such a bright star? He went on, almost as if thinking aloud. Not merely with words, but with an act of finality. He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room as if searching for those very traces. We must look for the tangible traces of that desperate act, Watson. The tools, the methods, the subtle evidence left by a hand forced by intellectual panic, explained Sherlock Holmes. His gaze sharpened, turning from the abstract to the practical. It was clear his mind was already shifting, preparing for the next phase of the hunt, a search for something concrete amidst the stellar dust of Miss Kingsley's genius. Within our Baker Street lodgings, flickering gaslight cast long, dancing shadows. These shifting shapes, I fancied, mirrored the dark conclusions Holmes was drawing as he finished laying out Miss Kingsley's revolutionary theories. The motive for her silencing struck me with chilling clarity. A grim picture of professional jealousy, the sort that could, I suppose, curdle into murderous intent. Yet I knew well from Holmes's practice that motive alone, however potent, would never satisfy a court of law. His voice, which had been vibrant with the intellectual chase, now settled into a tone of grim determination. The motive is established, Watson. Now, we must forge the chain that binds our suspect to the crime. The chalk, my friend, the chalk is our next link, declared Sherlock Holmes. I must confess, my own mind had initially dismissed the chalk fragment. It seemed a rather common, almost trivial find. A piece of chalk, after all, is a ubiquitous substance. Holmes, naturally, held a far more penetrating view. As we embarked on our quest the following morning, London greeted us with a damp chill. The clatter of early milk carts mingled with a newsboy's distant cry, composing the familiar symphony of urban awakening. Watson, this is no common blackboard chalk. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he held the fragment to the light. Its texture, its composition, it speaks of a finer grade, likely imported. We must seek out those specialist purveyors who cater to artists and perhaps fastidious academics, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Our pursuit of this peculiar chalk led us through a veritable labyrinth of narrow city streets. The ceaseless rumble of drays over cobblestones was our constant, jarring accompaniment. We tramped in and out of several stationers and artist suppliers, each visit adding to the grime on our boots. One establishment was particularly dusty. There, the air hung thick with the mingled scents of turpentine and decaying paper, and the proprietor, a wizened fellow whose fingers seemed permanently stained with ink, peered intently at the sample Holmes presented. He adjusted his spectacles, his voice a dry rustle. Ah, yes, this is Blanchard Pierrette Fils from Chartres, a superior chalk quite distinct. Not many in London stock it, sir. Too dear for most, chalk supplier said. The first supplier, though unable to help directly, furnished us with two further addresses. These were establishments, he said, known for their exclusive imports. Our initial call proved fruitless. The shopkeeper merely shook his head. As we took our leave, the bell above his door sounded a rather mournful jingle. However, at the second address, our prospects brightened. It was a quiet, almost austere emporium nestled in a more fashionable quarter, and I sensed our luck was about to turn. The very air within was still. It carried the refined scent of fine leather and expensive parchment, a world away from the dusty shops we had previously canvassed. Holmes addressed the proprietor, a man of precise demeanor and quiet speech. "We are making inquiries regarding a particular type of French chalk, a sample of which I have here," deduced Sherlock Holmes. The proprietor, a man whose neatness was a study in itself, took the fragment and examined it with what was clearly an expert eye. His reply was measured. "Indeed, sir, this is the finest grade of Blanchards. We are one of perhaps 3 establishments in London that import it directly. We cater to a very discerning clientele," remarked chalk supplier. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice acquiring a sharper edge. "And would Professor Julian Thorne be amongst that discerning clientele?" deduced Sherlock Holmes. The supplier turned to a substantial ledger. Its thick pages whispered with a soft swish as he consulted them. A palpable silence descended upon the shop. It was so profound that the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner seemed to echo Holmes's own unspoken anticipation. I found myself holding my breath. "Professor Thorne, yes. He is a regular purchaser of this very chalk. In fact," he paused, running a finger down a column, "he purchased our entire last shipment of this specific variety, the demi-sec fine grain, just over a fortnight ago. He was, in fact, the sole recipient of that batch, as we had only a limited quantity arrive," remarked chalk supplier. I saw it then, a look of triumph, fleeting but utterly unmistakable, flashed across Holmes's keen features. We stepped back out into the bustling thoroughfare. For a moment, the usual cacophony of horse-drawn omnibuses and vendors' cries seemed to recede, as if the city itself held its breath for Holmes's pronouncement. His voice was low but charged with energy. "You see, Watson, the net tightens. It is not merely that Thorne uses such chalk, but that he is the only recent purchaser of this specific batch. The fragment we found at Miss Kingsley's observatory is no longer a generic clue. It is a direct, almost personal, link to Professor Thorne. He had this unique chalk, and it was found at the scene," replied Sherlock Holmes. "Good heavens, Holmes!" I exclaimed, the full and terrible import of this discovery finally dawning upon my mind. "To think that he alone received that particular shipment! Why, the implications are damning indeed. It is tantamount to finding the very piece of chalk in his possession," Dr. John Watson inquired. He nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Damning, Watson, but not yet definitive proof of murder. He may argue he visited her, dropped the chalk. We need more. We need to understand what he might yet seek from that observatory. I believe a vigil is in order. A night visit to the scene of the crime might prove most illuminating," stated Sherlock Holmes. The prospect of a clandestine return to that lonely observatory sent an undeniable shiver down my spine. Professor Thorne's shadow now loomed so much larger, more menacingly, filling me with anticipation, and I confess, a touch of apprehension. Holmes was right. The game was most certainly afoot. I felt the stakes rising with every passing hour, drawing us towards an unknown climax. The night air hung cold and still as Holmes, and I took up our vigil outside Miss Kingsley's isolated observatory. An owl hooted in the distance, breaking the eerie silence. A sliver of moon cast long, skeletal shadows from the dome and the surrounding, sparsely leafed trees, their branches whispering faintly in the slight breeze. The distant, muffled rumble of London was barely perceptible here. Instead, we heard the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. The observatory's structure gave a faint, metallic creak as it settled in the chill. We positioned ourselves within a dense thicket of rhododendrons. This spot gave us a clear view of the main entrance, and more importantly, the small, unsecured side door Lily Morstan had identified. Holmes finally spoke, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the silence. "The chalk, Watson, was a significant misstep for our quarry. A man so meticulous in his scientific pursuits, yet so careless in his criminal ones. He believes himself safe, but the fear of overlooked evidence will prey upon his mind. He will return, remarked Sherlock Holmes. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the shadowed building. For what, precisely, Holmes? I wondered aloud. What could he have possibly missed that now draws him back into such danger? Miss Kingsley's final summation, Watson. It is the very essence of her discovery. He secured her research, yes, but in his haste, or perhaps his arrogance, he overlooked one crucial document. This document would most damningly prove his plagiarism, and therefore his motive. I'd wager it's a specific notebook containing her conclusive proofs. He will seek to destroy it. Hours crawled by. The moon climbed higher, casting shifting shadows across the frosted grass. My limbs grew stiff with cold and inaction. Holmes, however, remained as still and alert as a hunting cat. Then a faint sound reached our ears, amplified by the stillness, the cautious crunch of a footstep on the gravel path. It led not to the main door, but to the side. A dark figure emerged from the deeper shadows. He moved with a furtive haste that spoke volumes. The telltale click of the latch on the side door, though slight, sounded sharp and distinct in the profound quiet. He uttered a soft, satisfied sound. Our patience is rewarded, Professor Thorne as expected. Through a grimy windowpane, we could discern a flickering light within. It was Thorne, shielding a small lantern. He moved with desperate energy. We heard the muffled thud of books pulled from shelves and the frantic rustle as he scattered papers. His silhouette was a study in frantic anxiety. His search clearly focused on the main work desk, where Miss Kingsley would have spent her final hours. The rustling of papers inside grew more agitated, louder now. We saw him snatch up a slim, leather-bound volume. His shoulders slumped in what appeared to be a mixture of relief and dread. He then made directly for the cold stove in the corner of the room. "Now, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice suddenly taut with purpose, and he began to move with surprising speed from our concealment. Explained Sherlock Holmes. We burst through the side door with a sudden crash. Thorne was fumbling with the stove's iron door, the crucial notebook in his other hand. His own lantern clattered loudly to the floor and extinguished, plunging the room into near darkness. Only the pale moonlight filtered through the window. I swiftly retrieved and lit our own police lantern. Its steady beam illuminated Thorne's pale, shocked face. His voice cut through the sudden chaos, sharp and commanding. "Professor Thorne, I believe your nocturnal studies are at an end. That notebook, if you please." Thorne stood frozen, the notebook clutched tightly to his chest. His breath came in loud, ragged gasps, audible in the sudden quiet. His eyes were wide with terror and defeat. The fight visibly drained from him. He was left a slumped, broken figure. His voice, starting as a choked whisper, cracked with utter desolation. It cannot be, all of it, my entire legacy, shattered," answered Professor Julian Thorne. "Oh, but it can, Professor," Holmes replied. His tone was devoid of triumph, merely stating fact. "This is Miss Kingsley's final, summarized proof. It is the one item that would clearly show your intellectual theft. It also provides the undeniable motive for her silencing. You were so close to destroying it." He gestured towards the stove. "A desperate act, Professor, and a damning one," Sherlock Holmes responded. Thorne offered no resistance as I took the notebook from him. The evidence was secured. The culprit was caught red-handed trying to destroy the final traces of Miss Kingsley's genius. The chill of the observatory seemed to deepen. It was the chill of a case drawing to its inevitable, grim conclusion. The net, so carefully woven, had finally closed. The Scotland Yard interrogation room's chill seeped into our bones, a stark contrast to last night's heated events. Professor Julian Thorne sat hunched opposite us, his tweed jacket rumpled, his face a mask of grey exhaustion. The gas lamp on the plain wooden table cast harsh shadows, deepening the lines of strain around his eyes. Inspector Lestrade, a bulky silhouette by the door, observed with grim satisfaction. The occasional rustle of his notebook was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, yet it carried the sharp edge of a finely honed blade. Professor Thorne, we know you were at Miss Kingsley's observatory last night without permission. We also know you entered through the unsecured side door. The question is not if you were there, but why, declared Sherlock Holmes. Thorne shifted. His gaze darted from Holmes to me, then to the floor. A faint tremor ran through his hands, clasped tightly on his lap. His voice was raspy, a mere shadow of its former confidence. I merely wish to examine her recent work, pure scientific curiosity, nothing more, Professor Julian Thorne answered. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Professor, and so urgently that you risked forced entry, an entry you knew was available. Your desperation to retrieve something was clear. I suggest it was not general curiosity, but a very specific goal. Miss Kingsley's final notebook, the one with her complete discovery, declared Sherlock Holmes. The professor flinched as if struck. The fight seemed to drain from him, leaving him a hollow shell. The silence stretched. It was broken only by the distant, mournful hoot of a foghorn from the Thames, underscoring the bleakness of the moment. He began to speak. His voice was barely a whisper, yet each word fell with heavy finality. She was brilliant, too brilliant. If proven, her theories would have undone decades of my work, my entire reputation. Professor Julian Thorne answered. He paused, swallowing hard. Lestrade leaned forward, his pen poised. I had seen glimpses of her calculations and heard whispers. I dismissed them publicly, but privately. I knew she was close to something monumental. A woman. To be overshadowed by her, it was an intolerable prospect. Professor Julian Thorne replied. So you sought to steal her discovery, I interjected, my voice filled with revulsion. Ask Dr. John Watson. He looked at me. A flicker of his old arrogance surfaced briefly, then vanished into despair. Not steal at first. I wanted to understand, to find a flaw, but her logic was perfect. When I first entered her observatory, after she was gone, I took her main research notes. I believed that would be enough to silence her claims and let me present a modified version as my own. But I realized I had missed the crucial summary, the final part of her proof. If that notebook were found, it would expose me completely. I had to get it back. I had to destroy it, replied Professor Julian Thorne. And Miss Kingsley herself, Professor. Her death was no suicide, was it? Your fear of her coming announcement, her undeniable proof, drove you to a more permanent solution. Sherlock Holmes noted. Thorne buried his face in his hands. A dry, ragged sob escaped him, a sound utterly devoid of dignity. The confession tumbled out then, a torrent of professional jealousy, wounded pride, and chilling cruelty, driven by his desperate attempt to preserve his esteemed position. He spoke of societal expectations, that a man of his stature should not be eclipsed by a woman. This abhorrent sentiment had festered, poisoning his ambition and twisting it into something monstrous. The gaslight flickered, its dancing shadows seeming to writhe with the ugliness of his admission. When Thorne finally fell silent, utterly spent, Holmes rose. His expression was grim. Your confession, Professor, will be recorded. Justice for Miss Kingsley will now take its course. Her work, however, will not be silenced. It will be her voice that echoes through the halls of science, deduced Sherlock Holmes. We left Lestrade to his duties and stepped out into the grey London morning. The weight of the night's revelations pressed heavily upon me. Holmes, however, already seemed to be looking ahead. His mind was no doubt planning how best to present the truth and ensure Aurora Kingsley's legacy received the recognition it deserved. The great hall of the Royal Astronomical Society was imposing, its high, vaulted ceiling seeming to absorb the nervous coughs and the rustle of papers from the assembled members. A palpable air of expectation, tinged with a certain academic frostiness, filled the chamber as Holmes and I took our places. A low susurrus of whispers and the distinct scrape of chairs on the wooden floor accompanied the turning of heads, as many a learned gentleman cast curious, and not altogether friendly, glances towards my companion, who stood with an almost preternatural calm before the lectern. The president, a portly man with an impressive set of mutton-chop whiskers, introduced Holmes with a brevity that bordered on the dismissive. A low murmur rippled through the audience, a sound like dry leaves skittering across flagstones, before Holmes raised a hand and a hush fell. His voice, clear and incisive, carried effortlessly to the furthest corners. Gentlemen, we are convened today not merely to discuss a tragedy, but to rectify a profound injustice. The death of Miss Aurora Kingsley was, as you now know, no suicide. It was murder, born of professional envy and a desperate attempt to suppress brilliance, explained Sherlock Holmes. He paused, letting his words settle. I heard the distinct creak of wood and rustle of fabric as several members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The silence was now heavy, charged. Holmes then proceeded, with meticulous detail, to recount Professor Thorne's confession, laying bare the man's motives and methods. He spoke not of emotion, but of cold, hard facts, the falsified alibi, the unauthorized access, the damning presence of Kingsley's unique ink on Thorne's preliminary discoveries. Holmes continued, his tone sharpening like a blade as he fixed the assembly with his gaze. Consider Professor Thorne's repeated public dismissals of Miss Kingsley's theories. Yet in private, he was consumed by them, a fact he himself has admitted. His frantic efforts to retrieve her notebook from the observatory after the fact were not those of a man merely covering a crime of passion, but of one desperate to possess the intellectual treasure he knew it contained, a treasure he intended to claim as his own. Holmes gestured to the charts arrayed behind him, blown-up reproductions of Miss Kingsley's meticulous work. With practiced ease, he wove the complex astronomical data into a tapestry of discovery, his words painting pictures clearer than any diagram. His finger traced a precise arc on one diagram as he declared, "Here is the celestial body Miss Kingsley predicted, a new point of light in our heavens, perhaps a distant star or an unknown planet, its position calculated with flawless mathematics, its existence confirmed by her painstaking observations. This very discovery, the one Professor Thorne was poised to announce as his own, was hers in its entirety. The proof is undeniable, etched within these charts, and corroborated by the very notes Thorne so desperately tried to destroy," stated Sherlock Holmes. A wave of stunned silence greeted this revelation, more profound than before. One could hear the faint tick of the grand clock at the rear of the hall. Holmes did not press his advantage with rhetoric, but allowed the weight of the evidence to sink in. He then addressed the assembly with a gravity that compelled their attention. He stated, his voice resonating with a controlled power, Miss Kingsley's genius was eclipsed not by any failing of her own, but by a climate that too often devalues the contributions of women in science. Professor Thorne's crime is the most egregious manifestation of this, but let us not pretend it grew in a vacuum. The path to recognition for Miss Kingsley was made arduous by biases she should never have had to face, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. There were murmurs now, but of a different quality, less skeptical, more reflective. I saw faces etched with consternation, others with a dawning shame. The president himself seemed to deflate, his earlier pomposity vanishing. Holmes had not merely solved a murder. He had held a mirror to an entire institution. He concluded his address, the vindication of Aurora Kingsley complete and undeniable. The silence that followed was broken by a smattering of applause, hesitant at first, then growing in volume and conviction, a sound that echoed with a newfound respect. As Holmes stepped away from the lectern, I felt a profound sense of wrongs righted, yet my mind turned to the future. Miss Kingsley's work, so nearly lost, now stood ready to illuminate the world of astronomy, a testament to her brilliance. The pressing question now was how her legacy would be carried forth. A palpable change greeted us. The Royal Astronomical Society's hallowed halls bore little resemblance to our previous visits. Gone were the heated debates. In their place, a solemn atmosphere reigned. Only the subdued rustle of papers and low murmurs of voices broke the weighted silence. Holmes, ever observant, absorbed the scene with his customary quiet intensity, his gaze methodically sweeping across the assembled academics, perhaps noting the scent of old leather bindings and floor polish that permeated the grand room. Dr. Alastair Finch, a senior fellow, took his place before the society. His initial skepticism regarding Miss Kingsley's work had been almost tangible on our last visit. Now, his demeanor was entirely grave. A hush fell upon the room, broken only by the faint creak of a floorboard as he shifted his weight. When he began to speak, his voice carried a new, undeniable timbre of respect. Gentlemen and esteemed colleagues, in light of recent, deeply regrettable events, we have thoroughly re-examined Miss Aurora Kingsley's work. The Council unanimously agrees. Her celestial harmonies in the unseen planet represents a monumental contribution to our field. It shall be published forthwith, with full honors, in the Society's annals, answered Dr. Alastair Finch. A wave of applause, polite yet distinctly appreciative, rippled through the grand chamber. Its sound was somewhat muted by the heavy tapestries adorning the walls. I saw young Lily Morstan, standing near the front, clutch a small reticule to her chest, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Dr. Finch then cleared his throat, a sharp, distinct sound that resonated in the expectant silence that followed the applause. Furthermore, to ensure that Miss Kingsley's vital research is not left incomplete, the Society has established a fellowship in her name. It is with considerable satisfaction that I announce the first recipient, a young woman of prodigious talent and dedication who worked closely with Miss Kingsley, Miss Lily Morstan, remarked Dr. Alastair Finch. He gestured towards Lily. This time, the applause that erupted was warmer, more personal, carrying genuine enthusiasm. Several members, whom I distinctly recalled as being particularly dismissive in our past interactions, now nodded with expressions of apparent conviction. Lily stepped forward, the soft rustle of her skirts barely audible as she moved her voice when she spoke, trembling slightly yet admirably clear and firm. Thank you, Dr. Finch and the Council. I shall endeavor to honor Miss Kingsley's memory and her extraordinary work. It is a profound responsibility, and one I accept with deepest gratitude, Lily Morstan said. As we departed the Society's imposing edifice, the heavy oak doors swung closed behind us, their ancient locks clicking into place with a soft, decisive thud. Only then did Holmes finally speak, his tone characteristically dry. A most satisfactory outcome, Watson. Observe how swiftly conviction can follow the undeniable. Their earlier reluctance, you see, was not merely intellectual disagreement, but the ingrained prejudice of an establishment confronted by a truth it was unready to accept from such a source. The evidence, once laid bare, alongside the clear injustice, left them little choice but to concede, lest they appear not merely mistaken, but willfully blind. Sherlock Holmes responded. Holmes raised his hand, hailing a passing hansom. The sharp clatter of its hooves on the cobbles, accompanied by the rhythmic jingle of its harness, was a sound so intrinsically London. Soon, with the gentle creak of the cab's springs beneath us, we were making our way towards Mrs. Hudson's. I remember thinking that the very air of her lodgings, always so welcoming, would offer a far more congenial atmosphere for the wonderful news Lily carried. And indeed, upon our arrival, we found the drawing-room of Mrs. Hudson's Suffragist Salon quite abuzz. The sounds here were of a decidedly different nature than those at the Society. Instead of hushed reverence, There was the gentle, cheerful clinking of teacups against saucers, the occasional soft laughter, and the earnest, animated voices of women deep in discussion. A welcoming warmth emanated from the hearth, carrying the faint scent of baking scones. Mrs. Hudson herself greeted Lily at the door with an embrace that spoke volumes, her own voice, rich with affection, full of a motherly pride. "Lily, my dear girl, we heard the bells of progress ringing all the way from the society. Tell us everything. This is a victory not just for Aurora, bless her soul, but for all of us," replied Mrs. Hudson. Young Lily, her earlier composure visibly softened by the warmth of this supportive haven, began to recount the morning's events. Her narrative, I noted, was frequently punctuated by soft murmurs of approval, and indeed, here, a well-deserved, there, and heartfelt expressions of sympathy from the assembled ladies. Their attentiveness was palpable. It was not long before the conversation naturally broadened, the gentle hum of voices touching upon the wider implications of the day's triumph. It feels as though a door long bolted has finally begun to creak open. Professor Thorne himself, who was so dismissive, even approached me afterwards to offer his congratulations and access to his own notes on related planetary movements. "It is a start, a significant start," responded Lily Morstan. Mrs. Hudson nodded, her expression thoughtful. She poured tea, the amber liquid streaming into a delicate china cup with a soft, comforting sound. The fragrant steam rose, mingling with the familiar, pleasant scent of beeswax polish that always permeated the warm room. "Indeed it is, Lily, a testament to Aurora's brilliance and your own courage. But it signifies more than just one woman's triumph. It is a beacon, I hope, for the many other brilliant minds striving for recognition. The stars, it seems, are finally aligning for justice in more ways than one," said Mrs. Hudson. Her words hung in the air, a quiet promise of further discourse and reflection. A collective, thoughtful sigh seemed to pass through the room, a fitting prelude, I felt, to deeper considerations on the shifting firmament of society itself. Outside, the distant, muted rumble of London life continued, a counterpoint to the significant changes stirring within these walls. The late autumn air carried a distinct chill as Holmes and I made our way to Mrs. Hudson's residence. The familiar clatter of our hansom cab over the cobblestones gave way to a softer murmur as we alighted. Within, the front parlor, now so often transformed into her suffragist salon, was aglow with lamplight, and the pleasant hum of earnest conversation reached us even before we crossed the threshold. A fire crackled merrily in the grate, casting dancing shadows upon the assembled company. Her voice, warm and welcoming, greeted us. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, come in out of the chill. The discussion is already quite lively, and your presence is most welcome," replied Mrs. Hudson. The room was comfortably filled. I noted several familiar faces from the Salon, women of intellect and spirit, their expressions animated. Young Lily Morstan sat near the fire, a new quiet confidence about her that was most becoming. The gentle clinking of teacups provided a constant, soothing undertone to the discussions. Miss Elena Vance, a writer known for her sharp essays on social reform and a regular at the Salon, turned towards Holmes. Her keen, intelligent eyes met his. "Mr. Holmes," a lady with keen, intelligent eyes addressed him, "we were just discussing Miss Kingsley's work. Thanks to you, her legacy will shine brightly through publication rather than being eclipsed, as some had intended," Miss Elena Vance answered. Holmes inclined his head, a rare softness in his usually sharp features. He surveyed the room, his gaze lingering for a moment on Lily, then on the earnest faces around him. The usual restless energy about him seemed somewhat subdued, replaced by a contemplative air. He began, his voice clear and carrying, yet devoid of its customary abruptness. "This case, ladies, has been instructive. It has served as a reminder that the most pervasive fogs are not always those that creep from the Thames. Prejudice, societal expectation, these two can obscure the truth, leading even the keenest observer astray. Miss Kingsley's brilliance was a star of the first magnitude, yet many, myself included perhaps, initially viewed it through a lens distorted by convention. Sherlock Holmes noted. A hush fell upon the room, the attendees visibly moved by Holmes's candid admission. It was not often my friend spoke of his own potential fallibility. I saw Mrs. Hudson nod slowly, a look of profound understanding on her face. The facts of Miss Kingsley's intellect, her dedication, her groundbreaking work, these were the unshakable truths. Professor Thorne's tragedy lay not only in his crime, but in his inability to reconcile his own ambitions with her undeniable merit. He sought to extinguish her light, fearing it would outshine his own. A common human failing, I regret to say, but one amplified by the societal structures of the day. Lily spoke then, her voice clear and steady, a testament to her newfound standing. Miss Kingsley always maintained that the cosmos holds no prejudice. Its wonders are unveiled to any mind patient and perceptive. She fervently believed true science should mirror that impartiality. It is my deepest hope that her legacy will be not only her celestial charts, but a clearer, wider path for all who dare to look upwards. Lily Morstan answered. The conversation blossomed, each member adding their voice to a tapestry of shared experiences and aspirations. Teacups clinked softly, punctuating impassioned yet measured discussions of challenges overcome and those yet to face. As the evening drew towards its close, Mrs. Hudson offered a gentle summary. Indeed, each step forward, however small, illuminates the path ahead. Miss Kingsley's star shines on, and thanks to her, and the ripples from this sad affair, other brilliant minds may now find their light less obscured, Mrs. Hudson said. Later, as Holmes and I stood upon the doorstep, preparing to depart into the crisp night, the sounds from the Salon had softened to a contented murmur. The fog had lifted, both literally from the London streets, and I felt, metaphorically from many minds. He paused, looking up at the clear, star-dusted sky, his voice thoughtful. The pursuit of truth, Watson, demands an open mind. It is a lesson that bears repeating, even for oneself, replied Sherlock Holmes. And with that, he turned, and we made our way home, leaving behind the warm glow of Mrs. Hudson's parlor, a small beacon of progress in the vastness of the city. The enigma of the eclipsed astronomer was solved, but the reflections it cast upon our society, and indeed upon ourselves, would linger long after.